I was holding a paper plate with a slice of cake on it when my father tapped his glass and asked the room for attention. There were about 50 people in our living room. Neighbors, family, friends, a few relatives I only saw at holidays. The kind of crowd that fills a house with noise and warmth and the particular energy of people who are happy to be somewhere together. I thought it was a toast. My father liked toasts. He liked holding a glass and having people look at him. "Tonight," he said, smiling broadly, "we celebrate finally getting rid of my failure of a daughter." Laughter moved through the room like something rehearsed. Not confused laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter. The easy laughter of people who had been primed for a punchline and were delivering their part on cue. I was still smiling when I turned toward the front door. My suitcase was standing beside it. Packed. Zipped. Ready. My father looked at me across the room and held out an envelope. "Read it outside," he said. "My name is Lena, and thank you for listening to my story of betrayal, resilience, and justice. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Are you on your commute, taking a break at work, or cozy at home? Share it in the comments so we can connect and swap stories like this together. If this story pulled you in, don't forget to subscribe, give it a like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next real-life drama. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation and the justice going." I took the envelope and walked out. The door closed behind me, and the noise of the party continued on the other side of it, muffled but present, like something happening in a different world. I sat on the porch step and opened the envelope. It was not money. It was 2 documents printed on formal paper. The first was a notice confirming my removal from my father's will, signed and dated 3 weeks earlier. The second was a notification from the bank. He had exercised joint access rights on an account I had held since I was 19, an account my grandfather had originally set up for me, and he had frozen it. I sat with both pieces of paper in my hands while the sounds of the party continued behind the door. My stepmother Renata opened it briefly. She looked at me on the step with an expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite pity. "You're on your own now," she said quietly. Then she closed the door and went back inside. I sat there for a moment longer, looking at the documents. I had nowhere to go. I slept in my car that night. I parked on a quiet street 3 blocks from the house, reclined the seat as far as it would go, and lay there in the dark with the engine off, replaying the party. The thing that kept surfacing was not the humiliation itself, though that was present and sharp, but the planning behind it. The timing of the toast. The packed suitcase. The pre-signed legal documents already in an envelope. The frozen account. None of that happens in a moment of anger. All of that requires days, possibly weeks, of deliberate preparation. This had not been impulsive. This had been arranged. And then something else surfaced, a memory from about 3 months earlier. My father had asked me to sign some paperwork. He had been casual about it, vague in the way he sometimes was about administrative things, and I had signed without reading carefully because he was my father and I had trusted him. I lay in the dark thinking about that paperwork, wondering for the first time exactly what I had agreed to. I went to the public records office the following morning. It took most of the day, filing requests, waiting, being redirected between departments, but by late afternoon I had what I needed in front of me. 3 months ago, I had signed a transfer document. My father had co-owned a residential property with me. It had been left jointly to both of us by my grandfather, the same grandfather who had set up the bank account. The document I had signed, the one he had handed me on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table with a pen already uncapped, had transferred my full share of that property to him. The transfer was notarized, witnessed, legally clean. I sat in the plastic chair of the public records office and read it twice. My share of the property, the one asset my grandfather had made certain belonged to me, was gone. Signed away by my own hand on a document I had not read because the man who handed it to me was my father. Someone had coached him through every step of this. The question was who? I called Mr. Osei that evening from my car. He was an old family friend, had known my father for 30 years, had known my mother before she passed, had always treated me with the straightforward kindness of someone who had watched me grow up and had opinions about how I was being treated that he expressed carefully and rarely. He answered on the second ring, and when I told him where I was sleeping, he said to come over immediately. His couch was narrow but clean, and he made tea without being asked. When I told him about the transfer document, about the property, the notarization, the timeline, he set his mug down and was quiet for a moment, in the way that people are quiet when something has confirmed a suspicion they had been hoping was wrong. "Your father didn't come up with this," he said. I looked at him. "The sequence of it," he said carefully. "The legal steps. The timing. That's not him." He paused. "He's not organized enough." He didn't say the next part out loud. He didn't need to. I spent the next 3 days researching Renata. Not her social media, which was carefully curated and told me nothing real, but public records, court filings, property histories. Mr. Osei had a printer and enough patience to let me work at his kitchen table without asking too many questions. What I found built slowly, the way a picture builds when you add one piece at a time. Renata had been married twice before my father. Both marriages had ended within 4 years. In both cases, the man she married had entered the relationship with significant assets and exited it with considerably fewer. The first husband had lost a business property. The second had declared bankruptcy 18 months after the divorce was finalized. Both outcomes had involved legal documents signed during the marriage. Both outcomes had involved transfers, notarizations, and paperwork handled quietly in the background while the marriage itself appeared functional and normal. My father was her third attempt. He was also, from what I could see of his property portfolio and investment history, the largest target she had found yet. And he had no idea. Mr. Osei knew someone who knew someone, which is how these things sometimes work. Within a week of sleeping on his couch, I had an interview at a small property management firm called Harland Associates. The work was administrative at first, filing, correspondence, scheduling property inspections, but the firm managed a substantial portfolio of residential and commercial properties in the city. I took the job without hesitation and moved into a small rented room with the last of the cash I had on hand. What I had not fully processed when I accepted the position was the particular detail that Mr. Osei had mentioned, almost casually, when he told me about the opportunity. Harland Associates managed several properties in which my father was a significant investor. Not all of his holdings, but enough. Enough that I would have access to account records, payment histories, management correspondence, the full administrative picture of how those properties were being run and by whom. I sat at my new desk on my first morning and opened the filing system. The front row seat I had been handed was better than I had understood when I accepted it. The irregularities appeared in the third week. I was not looking for them specifically. I was doing routine reconciliation work, matching payment records to management logs, the kind of detailed administrative task that most people find tedious but that I had always found clarifying because the details tell you things that the summaries don't. A pattern emerged across 3 of the properties in my father's portion of the portfolio. Maintenance payments that had been approved were showing as delayed in the vendor records, but marked as processed in the internal accounts. The gap between those two things was small, days, sometimes only hours. But it was consistent across multiple transactions over several months. More significantly, there was a name I did not recognize appearing with increasing frequency in the financial co-management section of 2 properties. The name was Renata. She had been added as financial co-manager 4 months ago, around the same time she had begun, I now understood, the process of orchestrating my removal from the house. I sat with the records in front of me and felt the picture coming into focus. Something was very wrong. I brought my concerns to my supervisor, a careful and thorough man named Mr. Addo, in his office on a Thursday afternoon. I had spent 2 evenings organizing what I had found into a clear, sequential document. Dates, account references, transaction IDs, the specific discrepancies between what the vendor records showed and what the internal accounts reflected. I had not editorialized. I had simply presented the pattern and let it speak. Mr. Addo read through my document without speaking. When he finished, he looked up. "If this is accurate," he said, "it's fraud." "I believe it's accurate," I said. "But I wanted your eyes on it before I did anything further." He nodded slowly. "You've done this correctly," he said. "Documented. Sequential. No assumptions beyond what the records show." He tapped the pages. "We need to verify independently. And then we need to be very careful about the next steps." He paused. "This is bigger than the firm," he said. "If this pattern extends beyond what you've found here, we're going to need legal counsel." I told him I understood. I went back to my desk and kept working. The video arrived in my messages on a Saturday morning. A former guest from the party, a woman named Petra who had known my family for years and had apparently spent the weeks since that night feeling uncomfortable about what she had witnessed, had gone through her phone and found footage from the evening. She sent it without a long explanation. Just a short message saying she thought I should see it and that she was sorry she had left. I watched it 3 times. The video was not of my father's toast. It was of the 10 minutes before it. Renata was visible in the background, standing close to my father, her head angled toward his ear. She was talking. He was listening, nodding occasionally, his expression shifting from uncertainty to resolve in the way that people's expressions shift when they have been talked into a position and have just finished accepting it. The toast had happened approximately 8 minutes after that conversation ended. This had not been my father's idea. He had been the instrument. She had been the architect. The loan surfaced 2 weeks into Mr. Addo's independent verification process. He called me into his office on a Wednesday morning and closed the door, which he had not done before. 2 of my father's properties had loans taken out against them in the past 6 months. Significant loans, the kind that used the property value as collateral and created real financial risk if payments were missed or if the properties lost value. The loan applications carried my father's signature. Mr. Addo had obtained copies through the firm's legal contacts and had compared them to other signed documents from my father in the management files. The signatures did not match his established pattern. Not obviously. Not in a way that would be immediately visible to someone who wasn't looking carefully. But carefully looked at, the differences were present. Someone had signed those loan documents. It may not have been my father. The debt attached to those loans was substantial enough that if the properties were mismanaged further, if payments stopped, if funds were diverted, my father would be facing foreclosure. He was being set up to lose everything. And he still trusted the person doing it to him. I sat in my car in the firm's parking lot for a long time after that meeting with Mr. Addo. I thought about the party, the paper plate in my hand, the packed suitcase, 50 people laughing on cue. My stepmother's face in the doorway as she told me I was on my own. I thought about the frozen bank account. The transfer document I had signed at the kitchen table without reading. The will from which my name had been removed before the party even happened. My father had done all of those things. He had chosen to do them. He had stood in his own living room in front of 50 people and celebrated getting rid of me. I did not owe him anything. And yet, he was being systematically destroyed by a woman who had done this before, who had found him, identified his assets, worked her way into his life, and was now in the process of stripping everything he had built before disappearing. He did not know. And despite everything, that fact sat uncomfortably in my chest. I sent an anonymous message to my father's personal email address. I kept it short and factual. No emotion, no identification. Just a plain statement that there were financial irregularities connected to properties he held, that loan documents required his immediate personal review, and that he should seek independent legal advice before taking any further financial actions. I sent it from an account that could not be traced to me and waited. 3 days later, I found out what he had done with the information. He had shown it to Renata. She had told him it was from me. She had apparently recognized something in the phrasing, or simply guessed, and had framed it as a bitter, destabilizing attempt by his estranged daughter to undermine their marriage and damage his financial confidence. He had posted something on social media that same evening. A vague, short post about people who couldn't accept being cut off resorting to harassment. He had used the words bitter and unstable. He had not checked the loan documents. He had not sought legal advice. I read the post and sat with it for a moment. Then I went back to work. Mr. Addo's legal contact, an attorney named Ms. Boateng, confirmed what the financial records were showing. Renata had established 2 shell accounts, business entities registered in different names, with ownership structures that obscured her connection to them. Over the past 4 months, funds had been moving from the managed properties into those accounts in amounts small enough not to trigger automatic flags but consistent enough, over time, to represent a significant cumulative transfer. The amounts were still growing. The shell accounts were also being used to hold assets that appeared, from what Ms. Boateng could determine, to be in the process of being liquidated, converted from property holdings and investment positions into portable, transferable forms. Renata was not simply stealing from my father's accounts. She was preparing to leave. She was converting everything she could reach into a form she could take with her, and she was doing it systematically, methodically, and on a timeline that was accelerating. Ms. Boateng looked at me across her desk. "How much time do we have?" I asked. She looked at the documents. "Not much," she said. Ms. Boateng was precise about what was required. The evidence we had was substantial but not yet sufficient to trigger a formal investigation on its own. The shell accounts were documented. The fund transfers were documented. The loan signatures were documented and flagged for forensic analysis. But documentation assembled privately, however thorough, needed to be formally submitted through proper channels in the correct sequence for it to result in action, rather than a counterclaim of harassment. One procedural mistake, one document obtained improperly, one step taken out of order, and the entire case could be challenged or dismissed. She walked me through the process over 2 hours in her office, step by step, with the patient precision of someone who understood that the difference between justice and its opposite was usually procedure. I listened to every word. Mr. Addo had released me from regular duties for the week to focus on this, which was the most quietly generous professional decision anyone had ever made on my behalf. I left Ms. Boateng's office with a clear sequence of steps and a clear understanding of what a single mistake would cost. There was no room for error. The first foreclosure notice appeared on a Tuesday. One of my father's smaller properties, a 2-unit residential building he had owned for 11 years, had missed 2 consecutive loan payments. The loan, I knew from the records, had been taken out against the property 6 months ago in circumstances that were now under legal scrutiny. The payment schedule had been set up through an account that Renata controlled. She had stopped making the payments. Whether deliberately or as part of the broader liquidation process, I couldn't say with certainty. The effect was the same. The property was moving toward foreclosure. A second notice on a larger commercial property arrived by the end of the week. My father had 5 properties in total. If the pattern continued, and the financial records suggested it would, all 5 were at risk. His entire investment portfolio, the thing he had spent 30 years building, was being systematically dismantled from the inside. And he was still, as far as I could determine, defending the woman doing it to him. Time was running out in a way that was becoming concrete and measurable. Ms. Boateng called me on a Thursday evening. Her contact at the Financial Regulatory Authority had passed along a piece of information that had been obtained through proper channels during their preliminary review of the documents she had submitted. Renata had booked a flight. International. One way. The departure date was 3 days away. I sat down when she told me this. Everything we had documented, the shell accounts, the fund transfers, the loan irregularities, the forensic questions about the signatures, all of it was thorough and legally sound. But legal processes moved at their own pace, and that pace was not 3 days. If Renata left the country before the investigation reached the point of intervention, recovering the transferred assets would become exponentially more complicated. International asset recovery was slow, expensive, and uncertain. The people who had been defrauded before her, 2 ex-husbands who had each lost significant holdings, had never recovered what she took. Ms. Boateng was calm on the phone. "We need her to make one more documented move," she said. "Something current. Something that triggers immediate action." "How do we make that happen?" I asked. "We create a reason for her to access the accounts," she said. "And we make sure every access is recorded." The coordination happened over the next 48 hours. Ms. Boateng worked with the Regulatory Authority's Financial Crimes Unit, who had by this point formally opened a preliminary investigation based on the documents submitted. Mr. Addo coordinated with Harland Associates' compliance officer. I provided the detailed account access records I had compiled over the previous weeks, organized and referenced exactly as Ms. Boateng had instructed from the beginning. The plan was straightforward in structure, careful in execution. A controlled delay would be introduced into the processing of a fund transfer that Renata had scheduled, a legitimate-looking administrative hold, the kind that occasionally occurred in normal financial operations. The hold would require her to access the accounts personally and confirm the transaction through direct interaction with the system. Every access would be logged. Every confirmation would be timestamped. The regulatory authority would have observers in place. We needed her to take one last documented step. I spent most of those 48 hours at Ms. Boateng's office, available by phone, reviewing documents, staying inside the procedure. One mistake and it collapsed. I did not make any mistakes. The hold was introduced on a Friday morning. By early afternoon, the system showed that someone had accessed the relevant accounts remotely and attempted to push through the delayed transfer manually. The access was logged. The IP address was recorded. The transaction attempt was timestamped and captured in full. Then, 3 hours later, a second access, this one initiating a large transfer from one of the shell accounts into an external account that had not appeared in any previous records. Panic transfer. The Financial Crimes Unit recognized the pattern immediately. It was enough. Ms. Boateng called me at 4:30 in the afternoon. They have what they need, she said. The formal investigation was open that evening. The shell accounts were flagged for freezing. The regulatory authority coordinated with the relevant banking institutions. The flight booking was flagged through proper legal channels. I sat in Ms. Boateng's waiting room after the call and held my phone in both hands and breathed slowly for a long moment. It was done. The trap had closed. The accounts froze over the weekend. My father found out on a Saturday morning when he tried to access funds and received a notification he did not understand. He called the bank. The bank told him the accounts were under regulatory review and that he should contact legal counsel. By Saturday afternoon, the investigation had become visible enough that several people in his financial and social network had become aware that something serious was happening. Renata was not there to help him navigate it. She had disappeared on Friday evening, not on the booked international flight, which had been flagged, but through an alternative route that the investigation was now working to trace. She had left before the accounts froze. She had taken what she had already transferred. She had not taken everything. The regulatory action had moved fast enough to protect a significant portion, but she had taken enough. My father spent Saturday and Sunday attempting to reach people who could tell him what was happening to his finances. On Sunday evening, he finally understood the shape of it. On Monday morning, there was a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole before I opened it. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he was the same height, same build. But something in his posture had changed. The ease had gone out of it. The way he stood at my door was the way people stand when they have been carrying something heavy for several days and are no longer pretending otherwise. I opened the door. We looked at each other for a moment without speaking. He had aged somehow in the 2 weeks since the party. The party where he had raised a glass in front of 50 people and called me his failure of a daughter. Where my suitcase had been packed and waiting. Where Renata had stood in the doorway of the house and told me I was on my own. I need your help, he said. His voice was quiet. The performance quality it usually had, the tone of a man used to being the most certain person in any room, was entirely absent. I stepped back from the door. Come in, I said. I made coffee because it gave both of us something to do with our hands while we found our footing in a conversation neither of us had any experience with. He sat at my small kitchen table and looked around my apartment, modest, functional, the space of someone who had started over recently and was doing it carefully. Nothing about it resembled the house he had thrown a party in 2 weeks ago. I set the coffee in front of him and sat across from him. The position was not lost on me. The last time we had sat across from each other at a table, he had slid a folder toward me and told me to read it outside. Now he was at my table. In my space. On the terms I said. He looked at me and said, "You knew, didn't you?" It was not quite a question. "I found out," I said. "Over time." "How much do you know?" "Everything," I said simply. He was quiet for a long moment, both hands around his coffee mug. Then, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I looked at him steadily before I answered. "I tried," I said. "I sent you a message. An anonymous one, because I knew you wouldn't receive it from me directly. I told you to check the loan documents. I told you to get independent legal advice." He was very still. "You posted about it," I said. "Called me bitter and unstable." He closed his eyes briefly. "She told me it was you," he said. "She said you were trying to destabilize us." "I know," I said. He looked at the table. I believed her. "I know that too." We sat with that for a moment. Then I told him what I had done. The firm. The records. Mr. Addo. Ms. Boateng. The documentation process. The regulatory submission. The coordinated hold that had triggered Renata's final recorded transaction and given the Financial Crimes Unit what they needed to act. I laid it out plainly, step by step, the way I had laid out the financial irregularities for Mr. Addo months earlier. When I finished, he sat very quietly. "You did all of that," he said slowly, "after what I did at the party." "Yes," I said. He had no immediate response to that. I told him there were conditions. He had expected this, I think. He nodded before I had finished the sentence, the nod of a man who understands he is not negotiating from a position of strength and has accepted it. The first condition was the property transfer document, the one I had signed at the kitchen table without reading. He would need to engage a solicitor and initiate the legal process of reversing it, using the documentation Ms. Boateng had compiled showing that my consent had been obtained through misrepresentation. The second condition was public. The same social circle that had attended the party, the 50 people who had laughed and clapped, needed to hear the truth from him directly. Not a vague social media post. A clear, specific acknowledgement of what had happened and what he had done. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. His pride and his survival were sitting on opposite sides of a scale, and I watched him measure them against each other. The silence stretched. I did not fill it. I had learned over the past 2 weeks the particular power of staying quiet and letting things be what they were. He signed the reversal paperwork the following week. Ms. Boateng oversaw the process and confirmed that the transfer document had been formally challenged and that the reversal was legally initiated. It would take time to complete, these things always do, but the direction was clear and documented. The public acknowledgement happened at a family gathering my aunt organized, smaller than the party, deliberately so. He stood in a living room and said, plainly and without elaboration, that he had treated me unjustly, that he had been manipulated into actions he should not have taken, and that the story he had told about me was wrong. The people in that room were largely the same people who had laughed at his toast 2 weeks earlier. They did not laugh now. I was not there for the acknowledgement. I had decided I did not need to be. I was in my apartment, on a video call with Mr. Addo about a new project at the firm, when it was happening. I found out afterward from my aunt, who sent a short message saying it had gone exactly as agreed. I read her message and set my phone down. The investigation into Renata continued. Asset recovery was in process. The outcome was uncertain in its specifics, but moving in the right direction. My father and I were not repaired. That was not a 2-week process. But we had begun something that was at least honest, which was more than we'd had before. I had a job I had earned. An apartment that was mine. A life built on nothing except my own effort and the belief of a woman named Mrs. Adeyemi. No, that was the other story. The belief of Mr. Osei, who had offered me a couch. The belief of Mr. Addo, who had taken my concerns seriously. The belief of Ms. Boateng, who had walked me through every step. And somewhere underneath all of it, my own belief in myself, quiet, recently discovered, and absolutely mine. The night my father celebrated losing me was the night he lost everything. I walked away from it into a life that no one could take from me. And I never looked back.